I'm Dominic Nichols, and this is Ukraine the Latest. Today, we discuss more reported drone strikes inside Russia, crowdfunding supplies for Ukraine, and a new report from Ukraine's intelligence agencies about how Russia is developing malware to target the Starlink satellite communication system.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
We need a military strategy for Ukraine to gain a decisive advantage on the battlefield, to win the war.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Friday, the 11th of August, 1 year and 168 days since the full-scale invasion began, and today I'm joined by our senior technology reporter Gareth Caulfield, and joining us in the dawn's early light from Colorado Springs in the US, and Robles from Ukraine Frontline, a non-profit organisation that has been sending supplies, mainly medical in nature, to troops in Ukraine since the start of the full-scale invasion. I started by running through the latest news from Ukraine and beyond. But let me start with the latest from the ground in Ukraine and beyond. So a fire has broken out in a warehouse about 4 miles away from Vladimir Putin's official residency in Moscow. It broke out late last night. This is according to Russian state news. So by midnight local time, TASS are saying the fire had spread to, well, they're very specific. They say 21,500 square feet. I mean, it sounds like someone's been doing a Google Maps impression. But they were citing a statement from the emergency services. Now, it's not immediately clear what caused the fire. There's been no mention from either Russia or Ukraine about a drone strike there specifically, although Ukraine tends not to comment on these things anyway. But it does mark the second huge mystery fire in the area on Russian territory, very specifically near Moscow, in the last 2 days. So this warehouse in Odinsovo, which is about 10 k's west of the city centre, it's a town or a suburb of Moscow, if you like. It lies directly between Putin's official residence, which is about 5 k's to the north, and Vnukovo Airport, which is a couple of k's just to the south. Possibly separately, we're not entirely sure, but Russia reported 2 Ukrainian drone strikes that were heading for Moscow. They've not commented publicly about. Oh, sorry, Kyiv has not commented publicly about any such attacks. Now, there was one drone. One drone was reportedly shot down over Moscow this morning. So the mayor of Moscow said there were no casualties or damage. You'll see images on social media showing the aftermath of the blast, with emergency services attending the area. This is about 5 k's to the west of the city centre, west of the Kremlin, right in the city. Not immediately clear if either incident, that drone blast or the reported one over to the west near Putin's residence, if either incident was related to the temporary closure of Vnukovo Airport and Kaluga Airport, the latter being much further south outside the city. But there was more disruption to flights, which won't have gone unnoticed by Muscovites. Now, it's continuing the pattern of recent days where there have been alleged strikes inside Russia, but also all across Ukraine, and that has continued. So Mayor of Kyiv, Vitaly Klitschko, said there were no reported casualties and the air defences had done their job this morning. Ukraine's Air Force said Russia had fired Kh-47 Kinzhal ballistic missiles, and they said debris from one of those, either the missile or the ballistic missile or the air defence missile that shot it down, had landed in the grounds of a children's hospital, although no casualties reported. However, elsewhere across the country, civilian homes were hit by missiles and artillery fire. For example, in Kherson, there were injuries there, no deaths reported, but similar strikes in Kharkiv up in the northeast have resulted in civilian deaths. In another incident, Zaporizhzhia City Council has released images of the aftermath of one of the strikes that hit the city yesterday, causing widespread destruction. There were many civilian deaths reported across the city of Zaporizhzhia yesterday, including 2 sisters, 19 and 21-year-old Svetlana and Kristina. You'll see film of them on social media busking in the street about an hour before the missile strike. Also in that attack, Natalia Terashenko, a 66-year-old teacher, was killed. An image from Reuters that we've got on our live blog. If you have a look at the Telegraph's live blog, it shows Ms. Terashenko's covered body lying in the street next to her handbag and a nice orange umbrella. It's been quite warm in Zaporizhia this week, but a bit rainy, so it's wise to take an umbrella when popping out to the shops. It's these everyday normal details that I think really bring it home just how mindless and bovine these Russian war criminals are. But anyway, in a separate strike in the city yesterday, a well-known hotel was hit about 7:20 yesterday evening. 2 missiles in close succession. 1 person killed, 16 injured. Very graphic footage on social media filmed from the nearby children's park shows smoke from the first strike, and then you see the arrival of the second missile. You see kids crouching when they see the missile and hear it going overhead, and then hear them screaming in terror when it explodes. Now, this hotel, the In-Tourist Hotel, as it's called, was very popular with journalists, just like the restaurant that was hit in Kramatorsk in June that killed 11, including 4 children and our friend Victoria Amelina, and also the attack on the Druzhba Hotel with the associated Corleone Pizzeria that were hit earlier this week, the so-called double tap attack on Monday in Pokrovsk. Now, this In-Tourist Hotel in Zaporizhia, part of the Reikartz group. If you just Google Reikartz, Reikartz, Reikartz Hotel Zaporizhia, you'll find it. So if I can do that, you've got to wonder how Russian commanders failed to realise it was a civilian location, if just a Google search can tell you that. Now, just as a reminder, so-called double-tap attacks have been used by Russia before, particularly in Syria, where a second strike hits the same location a few minutes after the first in order to, terrorise people, drive them away, kill first responders, emergency services, that kind of thing. There are suggestions now that Russia is deliberately targeting hotels and restaurants known to be used by journalists for this very purpose, to avoid scrutiny, basically. Now, I say that not in any way to seek special pleading for journalists or to suggest that if they are deliberately targeting journalists, that makes the strikes more heinous or more notable than the strikes that killed Svetlana and Kristina and Natalia Terashenko in Zaporizhia, or the 14-year-old twins Anna and Yulia Aksenchenko in Kramatorsk. But I say it only to keep us all up to date with the very latest thinking and the conversations that are going on here. Anyway, the hotel was also regularly used by staff from the UN and other non-government organisations. Denise Brown, the UN's humanitarian coordinator for Ukraine, has condemned the strikes, saying, "I'm appalled. I've stayed in this hotel every single time I visited Zaporizhia. My team uses it as their base for the frequent travels to the city. It was the UN base for the operation to evacuate civilians from the Azovstal plant in Mariupol in May last year." She said the number of indiscriminate attacks which have damaged civilian structures and killed and injured civilians, in her words, have reached unimaginable levels. And she reiterated that all such attacks violate international humanitarian law. Now, Ms. Brown called on Russia to comply with its obligations under international humanitarian law and stop indiscriminate attacks on Ukraine, quote, in the name of humanity, which I totally agree with. I'm not going to go on now about the UN, but I completely agree with her there, and I want, in the name of humanity. So in the name of humanity, just to finish this section off, the Russian Defense Ministry said its forces hit Zaporizhia in a place where foreign mercenaries were quartered. So that's who they are. Now, just finally on the updates, US President Joe Biden last night asked Congress for a further $24 billion, that's almost £20 billion, for humanitarian, economic and security assistance to Ukraine. If approved, that's going to bring the US's total aid contribution to Ukraine to more than $113 billion, 113, since the full-scale invasion began. And that funding is expected to be split $13 billion in security assistance, just over $7 in economic and humanitarian, and just over $3 to fund infrastructures in countries affected by Russia's invasion. Now, I'm going to turn now. I'm very pleased to introduce Anne Robles, long-time listener to the pod, one of the first members of Ukraine Frontline. Anne, welcome to the pod. Thanks for getting up so early. How's the weather? How's the weather in Colorado this morning? And can you tell us about Ukraine Frontline, how it all started? I think when we were chatting, you told me your first bundle of support to Ukraine was a suitcase full of shampoo and bandages, I seem to remember. But welcome anyway.
Thank you so much for having me on the podcast today. The weather is wonderful in Colorado, so I appreciate, even at 6 a.m., I appreciate you allowing me to come on here and speak about Ukraine Frontline. We started as a kind of an internet grassroots effort that we then formalized into an NGO. And it kind of really all started with our contact in Kyiv. His name is Mykola, and he used to stream on Reddit platforms about his life in Ukraine, and he had a good following. And once the war started, and once the lead up to the war, he would stream several times a day talking about the situation and his thoughts and feelings. And then right as the invasion happened, a lot of people were reaching out to him, seeing if he was okay, myself included. And that's when he used that contact to form a group of us to help him get supplies to his friends who were in the territorial defense that were immediately called up into action. And from there, it's kind of snowballed into this NGO where we are getting supplies over to Ukraine that are much needed. A lot of them, are purchased here in North America, where the supplies are more in abundance, and then taken over to Ukraine and delivered on the front lines. One of the reasons why we call it front lines is because Mykola does go out to the front lines to deliver these supplies directly to the troops, wherever they're at. So it really is going directly there. It did start as suitcases. We came together and got a lot of donations sent over to a contact in Texas, who also has become the president of Ukraine Frontline. And then we sent that first shipment over to Poland, where we did have a volunteer who flew with those. She flew into Poland with a suitcase, probably about 5 or 6 suitcases packed full of supplies, and then basically drove to the border, across the border of Ukraine, when it was still relatively unstable in the beginning couple months, just to get these supplies delivered directly to Mykola, who then was able to get them distributed to where they needed to go. So that's like the first wave that we did. We call it luggage logistics, because a lot of it is, not only is it packing stuff in suitcases and getting it over there, and this was mainly done before shipments resumed to Ukraine. Now we use a combination of both. We're able to use a company called Dnipro LLC, and then we also have individuals who volunteer that are able to put all of this, all of the supplies into their suitcases and fly it over.
Thanks. Now, you were telling me yesterday when we were chatting that you respond to the request from the front. That's specifically where the list comes from. And I had a look down, and I'm delighted to see there's beef jerky and all the rest of it, because I love beef jerky, but all those kind of things. But you were saying much more seriously that actually, and I think we've grown up enough here on this pod to be able to have this conversation, that you're saying a lot of people are asking for body bags. Can you talk to us a little bit about that, and about if you have any better idea than us on exactly the toll that is being extracted from Ukraine's young men and women during this war?
Yes. So, it really did start with medical supplies, which was really needed, especially at the beginning of the war. And even now, I know a lot of people are saying, as you mentioned, 24 billion in aid is going over to Ukraine. So a lot of times I have people asking me, well, why should I donate? Why is this needed if we're sending all of this money over? Well, I like to think of it as like it's government to government, and this is people to people. So we do get these requests from the front line. It started as cat tourniquets, chest seals, Israeli bandages. Cat tourniquets especially are important. With all the artillery firing going on, it usually takes 1 or 2 of those to get a soldier stabilized and be able to get them off to the hospital to get care. But until they can get them stabilized and stop the bleeding, then it's not going to help unless they can get that taken care of. So that's how it started. And then we started to get other requests. It started to progress to night sights, drones. We did winter uniforms. We've even, to the extent of, we've got a couple pallets worth of spare parts that someone has donated for an MRAP, which is a mine-resistant ambush protected vehicles that is needed to go over there. But recently, we have a group of us that have a separate little WhatsApp chat room where we're communicating with each other above and beyond what we have for Ukraine Frontline. And we do have an individual who has been over there working and helping out with on the front lines in some very scary situations. And it was recently brought up that unfortunately body bags were one of the items that they were coming up short on, which is, it is a sober reminder that there is a lot of loss of life on the Ukrainian side as much as there is on the Russian side, as much as we don't like to think about it. But that is why it is crucial that we're getting these supplies over to them consistently so that the medics over there from the Foreign Legion and some of these other groups that we support that I'll talk about in a second are able to continue trying to save as many as possible to get them stabilized and onto the hospital.
Yeah, I can imagine the requirement for tourniquets in particular is exceptionally high. I remember when a lot of our logistic drivers, so the truck drivers in Iraq and Afghanistan, they would open their tourniquet, they would loop it around. Basically, for those that don't know, a tourniquet is like just a big belt, effectively, that you put around your limb, your leg or your arm if you have a catastrophic bleed, and it just closes down the artery to stop the blood leaving your body. You can't have it on for very long because you can kill the arm or the leg that you're hopefully going to save, but it does. And the most important thing is to stop you from bleeding out. But these guys and girls would wear their tourniquets, the drivers, this is, because they would be preparing for roadside bombs or the IEDs, improvised explosive devices, and they didn't want to then have to be shuffling around trying to open a tourniquet packet, all the rest of it. So they were already driving with these things wrapped around the top of their thighs and on their arms and so on. So, a pragmatic solution. And obviously they didn't all need to be used, but when they needed to be used, thank God they were ready. But the point I'm making is that they would open the packet, so they were no longer sealed and they were no longer totally clean. So the more tourniquets that can be sent out, they're not all going to be used, but they're all going to be that basically have to be thrown away afterwards. So a particular plea there for me, I think, for tourniquets. But just one more for me, if I may, Anne. How, as an organisation, a non-profit, how do you give confidence to folk that want to help financially, support Ukraine financially? How do you give confidence to them that your organisation are not there as a false front? You're not scamming people out of money. You are genuine. You are who you are, etc., etc. Because, like in any walk of life, there's going to be some grifters trying to make money out of this. How do you establish your bona fides with people who want to help, and where can people find you if they do want to help?
Absolutely. So one of the reasons why Ukraine Frontline came to be was so that we could address that when we were asking for money in the beginning and assistance. Naturally, people's first inclination is to think, well, is this a scam? So that's why we did come together to join in this. And we found it's a 501c3. So it is a certified nonprofit in the United States. So individuals who live within the United States who make donations to us, that is tax deductible. We also are, all volunteers. So everybody that does any work for Ukraine Frontline, myself and the other board members, it's 100% on our own time. And we don't have any overhead. So we've got 4 board members. We each sit in a different time zone, just how it worked out. We've got one in Nevada, myself here in Colorado, one in Texas, one in Virginia. And so we're all doing this out of our homes. So we have basically no overhead. So pretty much every dollar that is donated and every item that is donated goes over to Ukraine. We do post updates. So as deliveries are made by Mykola, we will take pictures. Of course, we blot out the faces of those who are fighting and try to blur out some of the location, but we do post the deliveries of the items that are donated. So I do have a wish list on Amazon that people can go to and purchase items that are shipped to me. And then I, in turn, will ship that to a contact in New Jersey who ships them directly to Mykola in Ukraine. And so I document everything that I get and I'll post it on social media. And then once it gets received in Ukraine, we also post pictures of that. So you can kind of follow how the stuff starts in the United States and how it gets over there to seeing it in the hands of the Ukrainian fighters, which for me, I think is really cool. A lot of the stuff that I bought, during the winter time, we did a big push for Burt's Bees because they have a really great chapstick. And in the winter time, hand salve and chapstick is something that a lot of people don't think about that the soldiers could use. And so we did a big push for that. So it was really cool to see all the stuff that I had purchased then in the hands within a month over there being utilized by the team. So it really is, we're very transparent in that so that you can see that, and we do have, specific units that we support. So for instance, we have recently purchased about $12,000 worth of TACMED supplies that we sent over and delivered to the 5th Separate Assault Brigade, which is an elite brigade that was formed shortly after the start of the full-scale war. And then on top of that, we did another $10,000 worth of TACMED donations, which is tactical medicine, to the International Legion. So recently that was about over 20,000. At the beginning of the war, we did do a big donation to Kyiv Central Emergency Hospital, in which, I made a video about that of, interviewing the individual, the doctor over there that we delivered those supplies to. We also deliver to the Hospitalers Medevac unit, as well as the 72nd, the Honor Detachment of the Da Vinci Wolves, and much more from there. So we do we do have a fact sheet, and we list out who we are going to deliver those items to, and we've recently donated as I said, we've progressed into night sights and drones on top of the tactical medicine first aid, because that is something that it's really important that these units are able to get a hold of that. It gives them a really big advantage over the Russians to be able to have night sights and be able to spot them at night, as well as the drones for reconnaissance. I know that they've got, not every of these units gets, stuff, all of that funding that is going from the United States to Ukraine. It's, it takes a long time for it to funnel down to these individual units, if it ever does. So a lot of those supplies are coming from organizations like Ukraine Frontline. And I know there's several other out there that are, raising money and getting this stuff over and delivered to them. We did recently deliver a drone signal amplifier to the 3rd, and then also radio. So we did handheld and vehicle radios to the 5th, so that they are able to communicate with each other, not only from a walkie-talkie standpoint, but from vehicle to vehicle. That is, and we're, like I said, the transparency behind that of doing the updates and showing the pictures so that you can see exactly where your money or donated items are going allows us to kind of, basically the proof is in the pudding. You can see where that is going, and rest assured that all of that money that you're donating goes to the Ukraine, goes to the Ukrainian, the fighters. It goes to the International Legion. We do support we're working in tandem with a high-ranking legionnaire in the International Legion, and we're fulfilling needs for American and British volunteers that are fighting, in addition to everything that we supply for Ukraine. So it's really making an effort to get as much as we can to those who need it. So, and where you can find us at to answer that question is, so we do have a website, ukrainefrontline.org, where you have the ability to donate. You can set up a one-time donation. You can do monthly donations. We are doing a fundraiser specifically to be able to get a truck over there to be able to facilitate these deliveries. So we've got that up on our website. We also do other avenues for fundraising. So upcoming things that we're doing as far as a fundraising effort is we do have an online auction coming up. And, within that online auction, there's going to be sculptures and smaller art pieces and bottle openers, necklaces that were created from a Russian rocket that actually struck a stabilization point in Torets near Bakhmut in September. And this was a stabilization point that was largely manned by doctors from the 5th. Although that rocket did fail to cause significant damage, a doctor who was working with the 5th sent that off to a blacksmith in Germany who was able to create art objects from that. So with that, all of that is going to go back to the medical service of the 5th. Another thing that we'll have up for auction in that online auction is we've got photographs from a photojournalist called Christopher Ochigany, and he's the one who took a picture of a woman who rescued a bunch of disabled dogs from Bucha early on in the full-scale war, which is now a mural in Kyiv. So he has donated some prints of some well-known images, and those are also going to go towards the 5th And then also some trophies and treasure boxes from an artist that's based out of Bucha who creates the trophies and small practical items like keychains from Russian material that was destroyed in the Battle of Kyiv. We also have, he's a volunteer like us, and he is also working to get humanitarian and military aid to whomever is needing that. So that's the different ways that we are raising money and awareness. So there's a lot of different avenues as far as straight up donations or participating in an online auction. So that's different ways that we are focusing on raising that money. And then finally, we do have coming up in October, we'll be organizing a Ukrainian Freedom Fest in Dallas to bring more awareness to what's going on in Ukraine. We're getting to be close to a year and a half into this war, and we want to make sure that people understand that it's still going on and there is still a great need for our support ongoing. And so we just want to make sure that part of that is that awareness, that people understand that sometimes it's faded from the news cycle, but that doesn't mean that anything is stopped. It's still going full scale. And we need to make sure that we are supporting, the people of Ukraine, those who are fighting, both international and the Ukrainians.
Sure, we sure do. Thanks, Am. Thanks so much for that. We'll come back to you at the end for final thoughts if you're able to stick around. If you need to dash off to work, I completely understand it. But for now, let's, Gareth, welcome. The Telegraph's senior tech reporter. You've been looking at a new report from Ukraine's SBU, the internal intelligence agency, about how Russia is attacking Ukrainian comms, and in particular, a specific piece of malware they've tried to design to go after Starlink. What can you tell us about that?
Thanks, Dom. Yes. So this is a new report published this week by the SBU looking or revealing details of Russian malware that they've been combating in the ongoing cyber war, which kind of bubbles below below the surface of the conflict, which we see in the headlines and the pictures and the videos day to day. Now, the malware, they've actually released sort of brief details of 4 or 5 different strains of malware. And the reason that they do this is to give all their technical personnel and Western security companies as well the ability to know what they're looking for, brief descriptions of how these pieces of malicious software work, what sort of things they're targeting, and so on. Now, the most interesting part of this, and I should prefix this segment by saying that I'm writing about this in a little more length in the Sunday Telegraph, so do pick up the paper this weekend. The most interesting part of this is amongst the malware strains that the SBU have detailed and identified and explained the inner workings of, is one they call STL, which is specifically written to target Starlink or to gather data from the Starlink satellite system. As we know, throughout the conflict, Ukraine has been quite reliant on Starlink to keep its domestic and battlefield communications going, and is quite an important part of the Ukrainian military communications infrastructure. And we've done a lot of writing about how Starlink has appeared to waver in its commitments a few months ago, highlighting how much it costs them to keep the system online and all that. But we haven't seen much, and this is where this is interesting now, we haven't seen much in terms of precisely how the Russians are targeting Starlink. And this piece of malware, they call it STL, the SBU, is specifically developed to operate on tablets which the Ukrainian armed forces are using to communicate with Starlink. Now, just to sort of give a bit of background here, when you set up a Starlink terminal, there's an app that comes with it which you install. If you're in a peacetime area, you install it on your mobile phone and you get the dish up and running, and off you go. That's internet connectivity. It's meant to be a fairly quick and seamless experience which people of little technical knowledge, such as myself, can cope with and get on with. In the Ukrainian military context, of course, you're using specific dedicated tablets which have, to oversimplify it a bit, a good antivirus software on it to prevent people like the Russians from getting in and tampering with the device. This piece of malware is specifically developed, and it says here in the report, to operate on systems with mobile ARM architecture, and that refers to the design of the chips that run the tablets, which also reveals to us that this is a low-level piece of malware. This is something that's developed specifically to infiltrate these devices running these exact processor chips to keep them functioning. How this malware works is, broadly speaking, it gets inside the device and it connects to Starlink via the internal network. Now, when you set up the Starlink app, when you start communicating with the terminal and the satellites and all the rest of it, it obviously sets up a technical language, a communications tunnel. This piece of malware aims to get inside that communications tunnel and what it does then is that it starts collecting data about the system, pulling out interesting details, trying to think how to so I'm looking here at a piece of computer code, in effect, which the Ukrainians have reproduced with all sorts of very interesting things that don't quite lend themselves to being briefly and clearly explained in plain English for the listeners of a podcast. But it pulls out, by the look of it, about sort of 20 or 30 different categories of data: speed of connection, which secure portals the Starlink app's connecting to. In a way, I suppose, glancing at this, it could be seen as mapping out the which bit of the Starlink network that app is connected to. And if that data, as is designed into this piece of malware, if that data is then beamed back to the Russians for further analysis and exploitation, that can help them map out how many Starlink terminals are in use, how many users have got them deployed, which in turn, if you're able to plot that on a map by perhaps using a separate strain of malware to pull the device's GPS location, you can then plot out potentially the locations of things such as headquarters, communication nodes, important uplink locations that may be handling backhaul traffic for the communications infrastructure in that area of the battlefield. So this, and the SBU does explicitly conclude, this malware is used for intelligence purposes. So this is not a case of a piece of malware that's got out in the wild and has accidentally ended up on some unlucky person's Starlink tablet. This is deliberately targeted by the Russian intelligence services and has been written specifically, developed from the ground up for that purpose. And it's through these little details, this is a piece of malware targeting Starlink. It's through these little details, or there are other things I've mentioned here. It's talking about how they are developed to target the Android operating system in particular. That shows the lengths to which the Russians are going to compromise the Ukrainian battlefield comms, not only to spy on them and to map them out, as I mentioned there, but also it gives them the ability to look for weaknesses which enable them to shut them down. We know earlier in the war that the cyber components of the Russian attacks was very much focused on destruction. It was what we were seeing from the Russian security services was types of malicious software that were developed to destroy computer systems, just go in and delete absolutely everything. It's equivalent of sticking a digital sledgehammer through the hard drive, in effect. So there is the potential here to see that kind of malware that's deploying could be paving the way for that kind of ongoing digital attack to degrade Ukrainian units' abilities to communicate in the field, to relay vital data up and down between commanders and frontline units. There are other malware types detailed in this report. Some of them are there to ensure system persistence. There's one called NetD. When we say system persistence, we basically mean it's a piece of malicious software that will get itself onto a target device and then defeat any attempts by the user to either detect or remove it. Typically, these things disguise themselves as legitimate system files. The malware authors in Russia will give them names that are intended to blend in with ordinary system files and hide them within folders already present on the device within the operating system. It's all means of camouflage, but if you know what you're looking for, which is to say, if you've already got an image of exactly what that device should have on it, you therefore know what should not be there or what may have been added surreptitiously after the event. So that's how the Ukrainians and doubtless their Western compatriots in the cybersecurity industry as well are able to find these things, track them down, and then reverse engineer them and expose their innermost workings to the world. What else? We have Tor malware, and that's an interesting, unusual one. Tor, the onion router, is I suppose you call it the dark web, really. Tor is a web browser service which you use to access the dark web. And by the dark web, we just mean websites which are not accessible to ordinary search engines and which work through a slightly different set of technical things. That's a very brief overview there. Malware that targets Tor, what it does, the purpose of Tor is that you can get onto the internet or part of the internet without easily being surveilled. Essentially, it bounces your connection to the web through a whole different set of computers to obfuscate your actual starting location or your actual presence on a particular part of a network or mobile network or internet, local area wire connection, anything like that. So a piece of malware targeting Tor, which is intended to grant remote access to that Tor device, can give you, if you are the attacker deploying that piece of malware, a bit of an insight into what that user's doing on Tors, defeating that obfuscation, that ability to hide who you are, what you're doing, what you're uploading and downloading from Tor or via Tor. Now, we haven't seen much in the way of how Ukraine has been using Tor to date, for the obvious reason it's the dark web. We are in the dark. But the fact that the Russians are deploying malware specifically to discover the Tor, hidden Tor services and to gain remote access to Tor devices with Tor being used on them suggests that there may be an interesting dark web component to the cyber war, which, well, I may go away and do a bit of investigation on that one. Other malware strains that they have released and talked about, many of these are just to gain remote access to a device. Once you've got remote access to a device, as I've already skated over here, that opens the door to do all kinds of other malicious things for intelligence gathering or for cyber attack purposes, to disable devices or cause them to function in unusual ways, to interfere with programs on them or subtly alter files stored on them. There's another one here, wget piece of malware, which is to download the Mirai banking Trojan, which is a very interesting one. Trojans are pieces of malicious software, malware again, where you can compromise a device and you can basically make it do things that you want it to do rather than the user wants to do. The Mirai botnet, which was what this particular piece of malware called wget plugs into here, is a well-known malware network, actually, which the West has been fighting against for years, mainly known for being deployed by Russian criminals. So this is an interesting sort of wider picture thing here. We do know that a lot of Russian cyber criminals suddenly found themselves very closely aligned to Russia's strategic cyber aims in the early part of the war. And there was a lot of research and a lot of chatter at the time about whether this was patriotic Russians chipping in for what they perceived as to be the greater good, or whether there was an element of coercion here, whether known cyber criminals had had their collars felt by the Russian security and police services and were told, you will now work for us. So the inclusion in this SBU report released this week of details of a piece of malware that is designed to download the Mirai Trojan onto Ukrainian military devices is interesting. That could potentially be showing that there are cyber criminal elements within the Russian cyber intelligence services, the Russian state hackers, who have got an eye to thinking, we're doing the official work here, but could we maybe just plant some of our own tools for use in our own time when we're off the clock, so to speak? So that's, there's a couple of strains here. There's also the w.sh strain detailed by the SBU, which does a similar thing, downloads the Mirai Trojan. So I'm fascinated by this stuff, and listeners, I certainly hope you are too, because it gives us that unique insight into not only sort of the blow by blow, this is what's happening day by day, minute by minute, but with a bit of awareness of the field and a bit of creative thinking and a bit of informed speculation. Why would they install this? What could the end goal be? You can use malware, and you can use these reports that detail malware being deployed by the Russians to gain a better insight into what it is they're hoping to do, what their medium and longer term aims might be. So that is the value of the SBU's malware report released this week. And as I say, I'm writing about this in a bit more depth in this weekend's Sunday Telegraph. So listeners, I strongly encourage you all to get on the website, to buy a physical copy of the paper if you're able to, and you will learn more. Thank you very much, Dom.
Thanks, Gaz. That's something to do with computers, right? Anyway, sorry. Just before we leave you, so Wagner, or more broadly, Prigozhin's empire, the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg, he, as you say, you've just been talking about the sort of various franchises of Russian cyber criminal networks and what have you. Since all the turmoil in Wagner, since the mutiny without any bounty a couple of months ago, has there been a noticeable downtick, uptick, anything shifted in that side of it that we could attribute to turmoil, ripples in the Wagner empire, Prigozhin empire?
That's a very good question, Dom. Earlier this year, certainly the British government did say that Wagner-like cyber groups are turning their cyber sites on the UK, which by simple inference therefore means that we know there have been private cyber mercenary groups operating on the Russian side within the conflict. It's a good one, because Wagner are mainly known for their sort of physical, if I can put it this way, real-world military operations. We haven't seen a great deal of research detailing Wagner's own cyber capabilities, and the speech, I think it was by Oliver Dowden, if memory serves correctly, the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, He was speaking in Belfast. He said that there is an official notice out to UK critical infrastructure operators warning of these Wagner-style attacks. But it's not something that they really seem to specialise in. There's a great divide, I think, between the cyber criminals who are operating against the West from within Russia pre-war and the organised mercenary groups, which I find strange, because the primary motivation for any mercenary, of course, is money, financial reward, the ability to get your hands on wealth and trappings of power and what have you and so forth. It's a personal enrichment thing. The cyber criminals, of course, are making vast sums of money. I mean, there are pictures out there of Russian cyber criminals who are openly driving around major cities in Lamborghinis and other such top-end cars bought with the proceeds of their crimes. They were flaunting their criminal wealth. So I find it strange that an organisation such as Wagner, with its great interest in all that sort of dodgy side of life, if I can put it that way, hasn't really visibly adopted much to do with the cyber warfare or indeed ongoing cyber operations. I think it's quite likely that they have got some sort of cyber capability in-house or perhaps on tap, maybe for intelligence, espionage, reconnaissance purposes, and figuring out what their real-world opponents are likely to be up to at a given point. But no, we haven't seen a great deal from Wagner themselves on the cyber front. But then again, as we have seen, that Wagner themselves have, I think, perhaps not been as prominent as they once were after Mr. Prigozhin's little drive up the road towards Moscow early this year. Perhaps that's just as well, really.
Lovely, thanks, Gareth. And we will, of course, cycle back to you to get all the track those stories as they're going through. You're the only person who can explain it to us. But thank you. And just before we go to final thoughts, and blatantly magpieing one of Francis's trademarked good ideas, on the back of my Gordon Brown rant yesterday, and thinking about Anne's work and the theme of doing what you can with what you've got from where you are to show Russia that Ukraine has more friends than they do, I'd like to read out a short email we've received from listener Paul Parsons in Northamptonshire here in the UK. So Paul says, hi Paul, if you're listening. Paul says, relatively early last year, you ran a great little story about West Country farmers delivering pickups to Ukraine, which was the genesis of a similar endeavour here in Northamptonshire. Yesterday, we returned from our third trip, having taken out 10 pickups, an ambulance, and medical and similar aid for the front of around £200,000. A drop in the ocean, but appreciated and of some use. The purpose of this email is not to shout about our endeavours, but to demonstrate what your podcast can and does achieve, not only in terms of being hugely informative, thank you, but also how it can encourage individual effort in support of Ukraine. Well done, and I hope you keep it up. Well, thanks, Paul. We will keep it up. I'm glad you find this informative, and I'm glad you think we've helped in some small way to encourage you to start your endeavour. Your next trip, I believe, is November. Best of luck with that. Please do stay in touch. And we'll include a link to your Just Giving page in the episode notes for today. So thanks, Paul. But on to final thoughts quickly, because I know Anne's got to dash off to work. Gareth, can we start with you, please? Quick final thoughts.
Final thoughts. The cyber war continues in Ukraine. It's never quite as high profile as the launching of missiles, bombs and rockets. It's never quite as tangible as watching the front line moving eastwards as Ukraine's counteroffensive continues to grind the Russians back from occupied territory. But it continues nonetheless. The cyber war is still there. It's still bubbling away. I strongly suspect the cyber war will continue long after Ukrainians have recaptured their country and a proper peace is concluded, which results in Ukraine's original borders being re-established. For the moment, all we can do is sit and watch, and hopefully the good agencies like the SBU and their Western helpers and assistants will continue to detect what the Russians are up to, dismantle it and expose its workings to us and show us all what they're really doing.
Thanks, Gareth. And Anne, back to early morning Colorado. Thanks so much for joining us again today. Thanks so much for being a listener and an all-round bon earth. As a guest, would you like the final word today, please?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, Dom. I think that, my final thoughts for today, especially in light of yesterday's horrific attacks that resulted in the loss of innocent lives, civilian lives, is to, not let everything going on in Ukraine desensitize you. I know it's become easy. You hear it every day. You see it on the news. It's just becoming part of the mainstream, but it's still horrific. And we need to work to get Ukraine across the finish line, so to speak, to get Russia out of their country, to really, not only is it, are they fighting for their freedom and their sovereignty, but they're also keeping Russia at bay from going to the rest of Europe, especially the non-NATO states where there wouldn't be as much involvement, such as Moldova. So it's just, this is really a war where these people are fighting for their freedom. And a lot of people, as soon as this war started, walked away from their profession and went and joined and started fighting. And, not only that, there's a lot of foreigners that kind of dropped what they were doing to go over there and support the cause and fight. So for those of us who are unable to do that, as much as I wish, at my age, I could go over there and fight, I cannot. But what I can do is help spread awareness and, be continuous with that education so that we can get donations raised and make sure that those who are fighting are getting everything that they need. We also do humanitarian aid. So it's just really important not to get war fatigue at this point. And donations are down across the board. It's not just us that are having a little bit of a trouble drumming up donations. A lot of other NGOs out there who do similar work to us are hitting a lull. So hopefully this will help spread awareness to know that there are people across the world that are doing everything they can in creative ways to get those on the front lines what they need, and just to continue to support that, even if it's $5 or $10 a month. Every little bit that you can donate will add up and potentially save lives.
Thank you to Gareth and Anne, and remember to click on the links in the show notes for early access to our interview with renowned historian Serhii Plokhy. Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so that you don't miss it. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk, and we do read every message. You can also contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our Twitter handles in the description for this episode. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Giles Gear. The executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.